super plants, listen to 91.7 WHUS, all died.
Hello, you're listening to the 91.7 WHUS. The Mohalk Valley Formula is my show. I'm Evan. Sean, can you hear me all right?
Great, perfectly.
Perfect, awesome. So I'm here with a special guest, Sean Stars. He's currently a professor at the University of Hong Kong. Is that
City University of Hong Kong.
City University of Hong Kong. He's been published in Jacobin, Politico, the New Left Review, and various journals. He's doing some really interesting research in critical political economy. It can be kind of it could be kind of shoved into the field of IR, but international relations for those that don't know. But that's kind of another topic. Anyways, we'll get started. How are you doing today, Sean?
Pretty good, yeah, pretty good.
You're coming to us from Washington D.C.
Yeah, just arrived from Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that kind of brings us immediately into the first question, which is that, like, you are a professor at Hong Kong, but for this conference you have to go to Washington D.C., and I think that kind of I think that kind of speaks to what your work is.
Absolutely, yeah. Ideological hegemony of the U.S. for sure.
Yeah. So on that point, you kind of do work exploring the nature of globalization, and it's kind of at odds with a lot of the major narratives, but both in, like, popular consciousness and also in the scholarly work. Can you kind of explain what it is that, like, separates your work from the majority opinion?
Okay, sure, yeah. Well, I mean, so in the 1990s, there was a huge change in world order, right? So the Cold War ended, Soviet Union collapsed. And so we had these two separate narratives. Like, one, it was a period of globalization. So you had, like, this faceless, amorphous force that was taking over the world, was challenging the state. And then, two, you had these people saying that the U.S. is the world's only superpower and that the world is unipolar.
Yeah.
So you had, like, two quite different and, contradictory conceptions of world order. So I'm trying to put the two together. Mm-hmm. So, those who talk about U.S. as the world's only superpower, there's a very clear center of power. It has a face, currently an orange face. And with globalization, it's faceless. And so I'm trying to put a face on it, right? So I'm looking at corporations and the world's top corporations, and through this research, I'm looking at actual lists of profit shares and also the ownership, so who owns these corporations. Through this research, I'm finding that American economic power is actually not only as strong as its supposed height in the 1950s, mm-hmm. but in some ways even stronger today.
Yeah, totally. Actually, I mean, I didn't put this on the list of questions, but could you kind of go through it from the end of World War II, just like a schematic view of, like, what the U.S. did to entrench its power in, like, Europe and Japan?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I was just reading Henry Luce again. So he's famous for coming up with this idea of the American century, right? So he wrote in Life magazine in February 1942. So they already in 1942, like, the U.S. just entered World War II 3 months before, and they're already thinking about how to organize the world after the war in a way that maintains and promotes their power, because they already knew that they were going to, after the war, they would be by far the most powerful country the world has ever seen. Yeah. So you look at Henry Luce and what he's talking about in the American century, and it's how can we make a world in which American business and influence, reaches the four corners. And so him and Dean Acheson and other U.S. state planners, they designed a world in a way that integrates the other great powers under their hegemony. So,
and this is grand area planning, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So through a number of ways, like foreign direct investment,
Mm-hmm.
through diplomacy, even like cultural exchanges, political, and of course through the military alliances, integrating the other great powers under the umbrella of their hegemony, so that they end up depending on American hegemony and support American hegemony, all the while making sure that the U.S. is on top, is always like number one in the system.
So we should probably. I'm realizing this is this is over the FM radio waves. So we should probably describe what hegemony is, because I think a lot of people don't really know that concept necessarily.
Okay, so there's this distinction between dominance and hegemony. So American dominance is, for example, the U.S. invading Iraq. So it's the U.S. invades, takes over, destroys the government, et cetera, et cetera. Hegemony is more a mixture of consent and coercion. So there's definitely coercion involved, but there's also a lot of consent of the ruled. So the people that are being ruled, they actually consent to American power to a large degree.
Yeah. And so that consent is kind of in the form, it's like it's necessary, right? Because your research,
You've just seen Secretary of Defense James Mattis, and then Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, and the Vice President in Europe, reassuring their European elites, their allies, that hey, America is not only going to stay in Europe, but we're going to make sure that the U.S. is more powerful than ever, right? The military is more powerful than ever. So this is a totally different system in which they actually want and invite American power, and it's the same in Northeast Asia. So before, Mattis was in Japan and South Korea just a couple weeks ago with the same message, like, don't worry, American power is here to stay. So they actually invite American power.
Yeah, and you've been doing a lot of so can you, but before we move on to kind of specific country by country cases, can you elucidate a little bit more on what the foreign direct investment means, and kind of maybe some of the more stark numbers of U.S. involvement in foreign multinationals, and how kind of the idea of the transnational is a little bit of a misnomer.
A little what? Sorry, it was a bit choppy.
Yeah, a bit of a misnomer.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so the whole concept, the whole term, multinational corporation, apparently, legend has it, was coined by IBM in the 1960s.
Oh, wow.
So IBM was, dominant in computers and was taking over European. There used to be European computer companies, right, in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
There aren't anymore. So IBM was becoming more and more dominant, and so IBM's marketing department came up with this idea of the multinational corporation. So it's not America becoming dominant; it's this multinational corporation that is sort of this faceless, centralist power. But what I'm seeing in my research is that even today, after decades of globalization, there's still both American-owned and embedded in the American nation-state. So there's still very much functions of American power. And so I look at this in different ways. So one is profit share. So looking at the Forbes Global 2000s, that's the top 2,000 corporations in the world. And there's 25 broad sectors, and I've seen that American corporations lead in 18 of the 25 sectors and dominate in 13 of the sectors.
Yeah. Oh, now you're breaking up a little. Well, what Sean's talking about,
some are just unbelievable.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Sean, you started to break up a little bit. You can also hold the mic a little farther from your face, I think, because you're very clear, but it's kind of how when you have a mic really, yeah. So can you? Yeah, okay. So you're coming in good now. Can you explain what dominant in a sector means? Because this was really interesting for me when I read the American power hasn't declined for the first time.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's it's kind of an arbitrary term,
Yeah.
right? So, so no one really knows the extent of American dominance in the 1950s because, accounting and statistics offices were not as robust as they are today. So, for example, the World Bank, they don't even have world GDP figures until 1960.
Yeah.
So the supposed height of American hegemony was the 1950s, and so there's different estimates of what share the U.S. had. So some range from like a third of the world's wealth to like half of the world's wealth. So I'm just picking the midpoint, 38%, the midpoint between that range. And so I'm saying anything, 38% or above, the U.S. dominates. And so like sector after sector, like financial services, 66%.
Yeah.
Like, the American profit share in 2009 plunged down to 27% and is now higher than ever. 66% now share of Wall Street. And so the U.S. dominates in 13 of the 25 sectors. So over half of the world's sectors. So that's one aspect. But then there's this other story of financial globalization. So as the U.S. pressured other countries to liberalize their financial markets, and the IMF and World Bank and so on, Wall Street has been able to buy up more and more of the world's corporations. So, for example, over a third now, so 36% of the top 50 European firms are owned by Wall Street.
Yeah.
So the U.S. is actually the number one corporate owner of European firms.
Which is absolutely incredible, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this is something that people don't know yet. They haven't seen this data because I got this data from the Bloomberg Professional Terminal, which Wall Street uses. So academics don't usually use this database.
Yeah, I mean, so this is actually another thing. I was talking to Raywyn Connell last night, and she who's another leftist scholar and one of the foundational people in what's called Southern theory. And she said, kind of, she wasn't aware of your work, but she said kind of the same thing, which is that, like, there's this narrative about neoliberalism that it's amorphous, and that's not true, and you have to be aware of that if you're from the global south, because you can kind of, like, see, like, this huge, like, market penetration from, especially the U.S., and I'm wondering if you think that, like, for scholars, like, that's kind of true as well, that, like, you're not going to look into it if you're an American scholar because you kind of you won't, like what you're saying, you're looking at scholarly sources which as far as I know, you're the only person that's really gone through and done this kind of corporate ownership data.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of scholars and analysts seem to assume that with globalization since the 1990s that these multinational corporations are truly multinational. Like their ownership is geographically dispersed. So like the middle class around the world owns these corporations.
Yeah,
and they don't depend on any nation state. Like they're even against nation states. So it's both a theoretical gap and an empirical gap, I think.
Yeah. And that point about the middle class, I think, is really interesting, and it came up in your dissertation that, like, so there's a class aspect to this, geographic ownership, in that the vast majority of financial capital holdings are within, some really small sliver of the population. And that kind of reminds me of the inequality of the global inequality studies that the World Bank did. I forget I'm blanking on the person's name, but if you Google, if you're a listener and you Google World Bank inequality, it'll come up. But it found exactly what you're saying, which is that wealth is more and more geographically distributed. And also, it's becoming more and more unequal on a global scale. There's yet another interesting component that I think connects to your work, which is that in that study, like, all of the growth of the so-called global middle class was more or less between, like, people that make $1,000 and $6,000 annually in China, So I think it's about time we get to that question. Of a lot of your work has also been kind of looking at the developments of the Chinese economy, and again, the popular narrative and the scholarly narratives are both, like, in international relations. You're always seeing, the great Chinese threat, and you're seeing people like talk about this. And what you found is, why don't you describe what you've been seeing in the ownership data?
Yeah, I mean, well, specifically with the ownership data, I mean, again, it's the same story with Wall Street buying up more and more of Chinese capital. So even Chinese state-owned enterprises, I mean, they're still majority state-owned. Mm-hmm. But for example, Bank of China is 15% owned by Wall Street now.
Yeah.
Right. And so so I mean, even from that perspective, but I mean, going back, to the 1980s, like the whole rise of China is based on foreign capital, and particularly American and Japanese capital, setting up their factories, outsourcing their production to China. So the whole rise of China is based and dependent on American capital, right? And so the profit that Chinese actually make from this is really, really small. I mean, because China is the workshop of the world, it's big in absolute terms. But I mean, for the iPhone is the classic example. So Foxconn, Honhai Precision Industry, is China's largest private employer. So they have over 1 million workers, and but Foxconn only makes about 6% of the value of the iPhone, right? And the rest of it, like the vast majority of it, goes to Apple, right? Of course. Mm-hmm. So China's growth is really dependent on the U.S. And so, I mean, things are a bit confusing now at the top because the president, Xi Jinping, came to power in 2013. He's a lot more assertive than previous Chinese presidents. So, but that's partly because of the slowdown of China. So China's slowing down now since 2013 or so. And so to distract the domestic population from China's increasing domestic economic problems, he's turning to nationalism, and he's turning to more assertive foreign policy. So it looks like China is becoming more of a threat, but I think they're really overplaying their hand at the moment.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you look at like military spending, the U.S. is like 6 times higher still. And you make I think really good point that there's a limit. So like what you just said, like a lot of the manufacturing, the majority of the profit goes to foreign firms, mostly in America. But then even in the spaces where the Chinese are the majority holder and the dominant in the sector, like there's still really like kind of sturdy limits to the possible growth. Can you kind of explain some of that, like in banking and like telecommunications and construction?
Yeah, well, one aspect of this is that even if they are state-owned enterprises, Wall Street is getting a larger and larger cut from their profit. But apart from that, there's structural limits because of China's growth model, right? So since the 1980s, they started privatizing a lot of the land and changing a lot of how the agriculture is organized, and so it forced peasants to move into the cities. Mm-hmm. So the whole like rise of China, workshop of the world, is from about 220 million rural migrants from the countryside into the cities, and so. There's a complicated household registration system called the WHUS system. So the rural migrants that live in the cities, their household registration is still from the countryside. So when they live in the cities, they're not allowed to get any social welfare. So they can't send their kids to school, they can't go to the hospital, and so on when they live in the city. So for China to change its growth model to become more consumption driven like the US, which is how countries really get wealthy, China would have to change its household registration system, improve the living standards of the Chinese working class, but then that would hurt the export model, right? Because they they depend on cheap labor.
Yeah.
So like right now China's stuck. So it's instead of making these changes, the Chinese state has jumped in with massive state investment.
Mm-hmm.
But there's only so many airports you can build, right? There's only so many trains you can build. So like China's slowing now, and I think its future is going to be like Japan. It's going to stagnate for decades.
So do you think that it's? So I guess I mean this. Maybe this is just me projecting, but it seems like the real solution for China is to become communist.
Yeah, well, that's a whole other interesting thing. I mean, so my MA students in Hong Kong, the majority of them are from the mainland, right? Like 90% are from the mainland, and most of them think that China is communist, right?
Wow.
They don't. They think it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. So they don't believe me when I say that China's capitalist. So then I pull up the list because China has the number 2 most billionaires in the world now, right? So I pull up this list and I say, are these billionaires all socialists? And so then they get really confused. And then we start talking about private ownership of capital and so on. Mm-hmm. So it's really interesting. But yeah, so like Maoism is a very dirty word in China, right? So everyone brings up the Cultural Revolution, Great Leap Forward, and so on. So that really prevents debate on how to change, China's current state capitalist model to a more equitable model.
Well, I'm wondering, is there any policies that you could see them implementing short of full socialized production and ownership of everything, that they could develop? You're frozen. Can you hear me? All right, Sean is frozen.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, you're unfrozen now, and you're frozen again, and you're not frozen. See, this is one of the issues of using Skype. My listeners, is that
yeah, I heard you.
All right, cool. Cool, you're in. You're good. Hello? Yes.
Oh no, you.
Now I'm.
Oh no, you got. Oh, hello.
Yes. now I'm
okay,
breaking up.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe. All right. Maybe I should close some of my other programs that I have open. I don't need that. All right. Can you hear me? Sean? Oh.
Hello?
Yes.
What was your last question? You broke up there.
Yeah, okay. So my question was, do you think that there's anything within that the Chinese government or the people can do to kind of have domestic development short of a full socialist revolution?
Yeah, I mean they could improve the welfare state, right? So I mean, become like Northern Europe or whatever. But there's
then that would be
these structural constraints that
man.
I was just talking about. It would challenge. Say?
Nothing. I'm sorry.
Did I cut out again?
Yeah, a little bit, but you're back in. Yeah.
Okay.
I wish that I had. Yeah. I would just say I wish I had this not over Wi-Fi, but you do what you can do.
Oh yeah. I'm in a hotel
yeah.
right now, so I'm relying on their Wi-Fi.
That's okay. Yeah. So we're back into it.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the power centers in China is Shanghai, and Shanghai was built from exporting. So, to change the export growth model would challenge their power.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's. Hello?
Yes. Yeah, I wasn't saying anything.
Okay.
Yeah. Shanghai's export. Yeah. So I mean that's kind of it though, right? That's a fundamental thing about the global economy is that all of these so-called developing nations, are dependent on an export model to function, and so like even within like a capitalist framework, they can't have real sovereignty without domestic consumption, and like so then you always are stuck with that. And I mean that's one of the reasons why I'm a socialist, is because I really don't think that like anybody's gonna give up that kind of power structure short of like taking over the factories themselves. Let me try.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're good. So let's get to another question. So then there's another kind of component of your research, which is more broadly than just the United States, is that there's still this kind of necessity of the state, right? So can you talk about that a little bit? For you published a recent paper on the so-called the transnational capitalist class school of thought in Asia as like a kind of a testing ground. Can you talk about like that paper, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, so going back to the contradiction in 1990s, people thought that globalization was challenging the nation state and threatening the state, or the market was threatening the state. But, the market and globalization, these are very sort of abstract, amorphous concepts. So when we put a face to these centers of power, we're really talking about corporations.
Yeah.
And corporations, they have an address. I mean, they have a headquarters, and they have specific owners, specific capitalists, who all have a passport, and they all depend on the nation state in which they're based, right? So corporations cannot exist without the nation state to do all kinds of things, and each nation state, promotes and protects their own corporations, right, within their national system of power. So this whole idea of the corporation as being sort of nationless and globally footloose and can go anywhere it wants. I mean, it's true to a certain extent that they can certainly move production, but they're still subject to national control. I mean, national populations can still definitely control them, if they shift the balance of power.
And kind of getting back to the U.S., can you? I mean, so I think the really interesting thing about like what sectors are domestic, right? Like domestically owned and produced domestically in the United States, because it's like high technology. I'm forgetting what other things there are, but I think that's really important, because that's connected to the military, and the military has this huge public investment in the thing. So do you think that has an effect on like what stays domestic?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the main reasons that the U.S. continues to dominate advanced technology is because of the military-industrial complex, right?
Yeah.
So, it's when you think about it, it's incredible that after 70 years, the U.S., like Europe and Japan, still can't overcome American dominance in global technology. And what what not enough people realize is that's because of the Pentagon and the Pentagon's investment in universities. Like I go to MIT in the summers, and you walk down the halls, and each department has this like little display on what the Pentagon has allowed them to invent.
I mean, even here, you go to the Information Technologies and Engineering building, and there's these plaques just right on the first floor that like it's like certificates of excellence from the Department of Homeland Security.
and thanks to the Navy Department, and I was just yesterday I was in the Smithsonian Museum of American History, and nice. I knew the internet and semiconductors, satellites, GPS, all of these things came out of the U.S. military, but I didn't know that M&Ms, M&Ms had a military contract, right?
Wow.
And that's what boosted their growth, and the little camera and smartphones, that's directly out of NASA So like it's just incredible, like technology advancement, and then it's not just it's like medicine, pharmaceuticals, like
more and more
agricultural pesticides, like just so many different things come out of this massive, $1 trillion, like you said in your email, like you have to include NASA, Department of Energy, right? Like it's not just the Department of Defense.
Yeah, and that's when I said earlier that the U.S. spends China by a factor of 6. I think that's based on only Defense Department spending. So I mean, we've been spending over $1 trillion on military related things for like almost 10 years now annually. It's interesting because you would think that working with Noam Chomsky, you'd know everything that was ever related to the the military-industrial complex. I just had a thought, and sticking with the military, there's an interesting thing again, yet another area of your research that is completely counter to the common narrative is kind of with the debt, right? With the U.S. debt. Can you talk about that and how like that is also a way of kind of maintaining control?
Yeah, well, I mean, since 1971, since the end of the gold standard, since Nixon unilaterally ended it, basically the U.S. has a free global ATM.
Yeah.
So because the U.S. dollar is a global currency, other countries, their central banks, they accumulate U.S. dollars because they're exporting, right? So they don't even have to export to the U.S. When like Germany exports to China, they trade in U.S. dollars, right? So like because it's a global currency, everyone's accumulating U.S. dollars, and they need to invest it. They don't want to invest it in the stock market because that's too risky. So they invest it in U.S. Treasury bills, and so it's like this free money for the U.S. As long as the U.S. dollar is the global currency, right? And so there's been different times, like in the 1970s. West Germany and France were trying to move away from the system. Like Charles de Gaulle famously said, "This is America's exorbitant privilege." And then in 2009, China and Brazil were both saying they want to move away from the system. They want to go to IMF special drawing rights. But then what China did since 2009 is increase its U.S. dollar reserves by like 400%.
Wow.
Right. So they're stuck. They can't. So like. If they dump all their treasury bills, then that would massively appreciate the value of their currency, the RMB, and then that again would hurt all their exporters.
Yeah.
So they're stuck. They can't do anything. They can sell a little bit, but they can't like dump because a lot of people say that China has all this power over the U.S. because China owns all American debt, right? But it's actually the reverse. It's the U.S. that has the power because they're getting this free money from China. So like China is like funding, the U.S.-Iraq war, wars in the Middle East and everything. And they're stuck. They can't move their money out into any alternative because there is no alternative at the moment. Right?
Yeah.
Still after like 40 years, there's still no alternative.
Yeah, and I mean, your research really shows how true that is because, like, even in Asia, where you would think like there would be some competition, it's usually like it goes like either the U.S. or a state-owned enterprise, and then who has like 40% of the company, like for the top 10 or whatever the country is, and then like the next one's like 6. It's like
huge dominance. And that like that sort of dominance, we see that in a lot of areas, right? So you mentioned like the military, similar sort of dominance, but also like even the share of the world's millionaire wealth. So like I define a capitalist, a dominant owner of capital as a millionaire, right? So someone with $1 million and above. And so Credit Suisse, their global wealth report, from 2015, they showed that 46% of the world's millionaires are Americans. 46, almost half the world's millionaires. So it's like after 70 years, this unbelievable level of dominance continues.
Yeah, and there's like in that World Bank report that I mentioned earlier, there's kind of an interesting thing where the author had gone through how like all of this income differential is like, or it was definitely income. It's like, based on location. And so, like, if you're in, like, the bottom, like, 10% in the U.S., you're still, like, the top, like, 50%, in the world. And he used this, and he was like, so there's no global proletariat anymore. And, like, Marx was wrong, and it's really interesting, because, like, he went out of his way to say that. So, but, I mean, to me, it seems like a pretty classic, like, Leninist, like, imperialist scenario where that's like exactly what everybody thought would happen. So I mean, now we've gone through all my questions, so I really could just I'm just gonna ask you some stuff that I'm curious about. When you go to like conferences and you talk to other like IR scholars, like IR, I'm putting that in air quotes, but this is a radio show, so people can't see that. When you talk to other IR scholars, what are common reactions to like what you're saying?
The most common reaction is sort of not understanding what I'm talking about.
Wow.
Because IR scholars, don't understand why I'm focusing on corporations and American corporations, like because they separate the state and capital. They separate politics and economics. And so, that's why I do political economy, because I don't think you can study these separately. You have to study them together. They're connected. They're deeply integrated. And so, but then others are blown away. I mean, there are like, I don't know if you know William Woolforth at Dartmouth. There are some mainstream, pretty big Irish scholars that are picking up on some of this stuff. And so like both from the far left and the far right, like I've had, so like you mentioned, I work with Noam Chomsky, but also the Cato Institute is inviting me to speak.
Yeah, I
bet. So like, on the right too, they're interested in this work because I'm showing that America is still globally dominant.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, that's an interesting point that there is kind of this like self-aggrandizement about U.S. empire that people have. I mean, I'm curious, like, do you think that like the business world has to be like aware of this, right? Like, I mean, there's got to be some consciousness of like their own, hegemony, like power, right? I think definitely for some, but maybe not for others. I mean, like when you're spewing propaganda day after day, you end up believing your own propaganda, right? Yeah.
So like, but no, I mean for sure. Like I think American capitalists understand that Silicon Valley, for example, is just completely dominant and so on. But the extent of the dominance and how other capitalists rely on American capital. I don't hear that so much. I read the Financial Times every day. Yeah. But I don't hear that so much.
Yeah, I mean, like even like Hillary Clinton. I'm saying even. I don't know why. Like Hillary Clinton, in her campaign platform was talking about, how we have to invest in Silicon Valley and like have this big like public expenditure into cybersecurity. So it really seems like that's kind of a component, is like this kind of like military Keynesianism that is going to maintain our power in this thing that like is very easy to have be completely secret, right? Like there's no corporation stealing like other people's like high technology like capabilities, because then that's the whole thing. It's its own thing.
I don't know if you saw this. Wolf Blitzer was
Wow.
interviewing Rand Paul last September.
Yeah. I did not.
Rand Paul was saying, the U.S. is supporting Saudi Arabia bombing Yemen. They're bombing schools and hospitals, and like the U.S. is like providing the airplanes, refueling the airplanes, targets, et cetera, and he's saying like we need to have a discussion about this because this is immoral and illegal. And Wolf Blitzer was like, so you think American jobs are secondary? Like, don't you understand that this, the military provides profits for the American corporations and jobs for people? Like, don't you understand we need this?
Yeah.
And so it's this really weird discussion between where Rand Paul was like the guy who was being moral, and Wolf Blitzer was like, you think morality is important? Don't you understand that massacring people is how we make our money and how our economy grows? Like,
that's and like again with that's what Noam's been saying for 60 years. Is if you look at probably longer, but he's been writing about it for 60 years. Is if you look at the liberal elite, they're just as war hungry as the most hawkish people. They just have different reasons for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And this whole thing about American decline, this is not the first time that elites have been talking about American decline, right? It started in 1957 when the USSR, fired Sputnik.
Yeah.
And so often this whole discourse of American decline is to boost the American military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
It's like, U.S. is declining, so we got to spend more on the military, right?
And there's also, this is what I'm kind of reading about. There's also a connection with what you just said with kind of the American decline and the university, because when the military-industrial complex gets spurned, so when it gets kicked off because of the supposed external threat that's always on the move, that's when this really big, there's yet another push for military research, which is often secret. I don't think a lot of people really know that. There's been classified PhD dissertations, which is really crazy, and there's sometimes separate facilities so that the military can pay for research and it's not on the campus because people don't like that. But that's the same thing, and so this is a question that I think maybe you have more of an understanding. So that was my question was question 3. What's your experience? I think I'm going to rephrase it. So in America, there's kind of this big connection with the military and with universities, and does that exist in the same capacity at your other places, at York and City University?
No, so because other countries, no, basically this is an American thing, where the U.S. military funds universities to this extent. Partly it's because the U.S. military budget is so much larger than everyone else.
Yeah.
But other universities get their funding from the government as well, but it's through the the education and science grants and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But no, there isn't this. It's really. Again, this is why American technology and so on is so dominant, is because it's really only happens to this extent in the U.S. And this has all kinds of effects, like the whole, the concept of the Pacific Ocean and the Asia Pacific. This was coined by the U.S. Navy.
Oh wow!
And the whole concept of area studies. So at City University of Hong Kong, my department is Department of Asian and International Studies. Area studies was invented by the CIA in the 1950s at MIT, the Center for International Studies, in order to study communism and to communist countries in order to destroy them, right? So Chalmers Johnson was one of the top scholars of China and Japan, and he was funded by the CIA in the 60s and 70s. So. Yeah, the connections are really deep, and this sort of connectedness is only in the U.S. In other countries, more and more, corporations are funding research, so that's a big problem. Of course, that happens in the U.S. as well.
Totally.
So we have that in Hong Kong, where pressure to get grants from corporations. But no, this whole military industrial complex thing is really only the U.S.
Yeah, and there's actually a kind of a discussion that I was having with some friends of mine. I have a friend who's Bangladeshi, and she kind of has issue with how political science. She's a political science major, and she kind of has issue with the way political science is framed, where there's American political science and then there's comparative political science.
Right. Yeah.
And we were wondering, like, is it the same like framework everywhere, or is it like just comparative? I don't know.
I mean, there are attempts in Asia to create like an Asian IR. I'm doing air quotes here.
Yeah.
But there's all kinds of like structural limitations, right? Because the top academic journals are all American,
totally.
Or Anglo-American. So Oxford and Cambridge are big too, of course. So they're all Anglo-American, and so even the top universities in China, academics have to publish in the top American journals.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you do that, you have to write your articles in a way that's framed that fits into American academia, and so it perpetuates American power again, like ideological hegemony.
And that's like so far from the public eye too, I think. Like So
you have that aspect, you have the universities, but then you also have like Wall Street and international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. So like a lot of
can you like speak on the IMF and the World Bank's role as far as like kind of creating hegemony, because I think that's like very like super important, and I would like to get that in while we're doing this interview.
Okay, yeah. So originally the IMF and World Bank were focused mainly on Europe, so reconstructing and reviving Europe after World War II. So like 1940s, 50s, up until the 60s, let's say. And then by the 1970s, their focus changed to the Third World, because the Third World was decolonizing, was rising, and communism was becoming more and more popular in the Third World, like Asia, Latin America, Africa. There are a lot of communist revolutions, national independence struggles, and so on. And so the IMF turned to the Third World and started giving what are called structural adjustment programs, so loans to these countries, but with all these conditions, like they have to do certain things. And by the 70s, 1980s, and 90s, the IMF has given the same structural adjustment program to over 100 countries.
Yeah.
And so what it does is it forces these countries to liberalize their financial markets, to liberalize like their tariffs, like import duties, cut down like protectionism, deregulate, cut down regulations, to privatize state-owned enterprises, state-owned assets.
Yeah.
And what's called macroeconomic stabilization, so that's like increasing interest rates, cutting social welfare programs. And so what that's done is allowed Wall Street to buy up, their top corporations, which is what I'm seeing in my data, right? So like I talked about China, but I could also talk about Brazil, India, even Russia.
Yeah.
Wall Street is buying up more and more of their top corporations. So that's partly because of the IMF pressuring countries around the world to liberalize their financial markets and privatize.
And then connecting that back to kind of what we were just talking about with like knowledge hegemony. Yeah.
Yeah. So some of the top economists in the world, I mean, they either work for the top universities, or they work for the IMF and World Bank, or they work for Wall Street, like as investment analysts. And so a lot of them too, they move into the Third World, like China. So like a lot of the top bureaucrats in China, they either got their PhD in the U.S. Or they used to work in the IMF or World Bank, or they used to work for Wall Street, like Goldman Sachs. And so it's not just the dominance of American universities that's producing this knowledge hegemony. It's also international organizations in Wall Street. Like they work for Wall Street, they get the liberal, neoclassical, neoliberal frame of mind, ideology, and so on, and then they bring it to their governments back at home.
Yeah, I mean that's That's really true, and I remember over the summer I was reading Lee Kuan Yew's memoirs, the first Prime Minister of Singapore, and that was really eye-opening for me, because he's very frank, and he's very much, saying we wanted to develop along the U.S. European model. All these other countries in Southeast Asia, like Indonesia was under Sukarno for a while, and he's like, he's a nice guy, but like he wasn't doing the right things to make his people prosperous. It's really crazy. Like Lee Kuan Yew was like kind of praising Suharto. And so and that's really interesting. But my point was that he spent some time at the Kennedy School at Harvard, the Kennedy School for Government, and it's like, the same thing. Like he was a traveling intellectual and like learning from them, and Singapore's a very interesting place. Do you have any thoughts on it, like on its development?
Yeah, well, I mean, Singapore and Hong Kong were both British colonies, right? So they're both city-states. And so they're part of like the second wave of East Asian countries. So first Japan arose in the 50s, 60s, and then South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong started rising in the 1970s and 80s. Yeah. And so originally it was manufacturing. So for example, Intel was one of the first companies to offshore production to Asia, and they opened up a semiconductor factory in Singapore in like 1971, 72, something like that. And so, but then, then the manufacturing moved to Thailand, Malaysia, and then to China. So now Singapore and Hong Kong are focusing on finance, right? They're regional centers of finance. Totally. But yeah, so Singapore has always been this outpost for like, American hegemony, because they have a free trade agreement with the U.S., but also like they have ties with the American military. So like the U.S. Navy always has ships there, and like U.S. Navy controls the Strait of Malacca, which is like south of Singapore, and the Strait of Malacca so like China gets over 80% of its oil through the Strait of Malacca. It's like this very small strait, and the U.S. Navy controls it because of their relationship with Singapore. So yeah, it's really, and you mentioned Sukarno and Suharto in Indonesia. Like we forget how much the third world in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were anti-capitalist and anti-Western imperialist. Like we look at the rise of the BRICS and emerging markets today, and like Xi Jinping just in January he went to the World Economic Forum to defend global capitalism. Yeah. Right. So like 50 years ago, the third world, they were anti-capitalist, anti-colonial, and they did not want to that's why they're called the third world. They wanted to move away from both the U.S. and the USSR. And so we have like Sukarno in Indonesia, we have Nasser in Egypt, we have in India and Yugoslavia, Tito in Yugoslavia and Ghana. But like now, like global capitalism, and partly again that's through the IMF, has made them so neoliberal now that they don't even question. That they global capitalism. They want to join. They want a seat at the table. They want to integrate. And so, it's big changes.
And like again, like that. I really think I'll look up what that World Bank paper's called, because I think it would be good if people read it. Because it really shows kind of like the extent of like what there is to kind of development, which is that over the last 20 years, it was from 1988 to 2008. Over that 20-year period, there was mostly just growth in the manufacturing in China. Like, that's really what it shows, and it's kind of taking it as this like really great thing. But like you said, there's more to it than just the numbers. Like people were, peasants were forced into this like industrial situation that like to make between $1,000 and $3,000 so that they can then buy products which how much of the domestic market in China is foreign produced, not produced, but like foreign owned companies?
It depends by sector. So some sectors, the Chinese state has a monopoly, like telecommunications and so on. Other sectors, like the most popular fast food restaurant is Kentucky Fried Chicken, KFC.
Yeah.
And of course McDonald's, Starbucks is huge. So like in luxury market, it's all like foreign companies. So there's, you see American brands everywhere. Like Walmart not only sources all their production from China, but Walmarts are actually pretty big in the richest Chinese cities itself, right? There's huge Walmarts in the mainland. So yeah, it's it's amazing the changes that have happened in China. I mean, like, because you can read the preamble to the Chinese Constitution right now. It still hasn't changed since Mao.
Yeah.
And in the preamble, it says, we want to overcome British imperialism, Western imperialism. So we need to keep foreign corporations out, keep foreign capital out. Like that's still in the preamble to the Chinese Constitution.
Wow.
And it's like completely opposite now.
Yeah. So that report is Global Income Inequality by the Numbers in History and Now by Branko Milanovic. It's from 2012. Just for the listeners out there. Yeah. Well, while I still have you, there's been a lot of kind of fear, or like general discussion about the potential of a military conflict with China. I know the Council of Foreign Relations just put out some big report on like the burgeoning Chinese threat, and like people in the general population are starting to talk about like the danger of the South Chinese Sea and the kind of competing interest there. Can you discuss that a little bit? I think we said an hour, but there's no one on after me, so we can go a little longer if you're okay with that.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I don't want to completely discount the possibility of war, but basically, I think it's for domestic purposes. So, China is slowing, and there's more and more economic problems like Chinese debt, overproduction in China, and this problem of trying to increase living standards, but then that would challenge exporters, et cetera, et cetera. So I think because of these increasing domestic problems, Xi Jinping, the president, is focusing more and more on nationalism.
Yeah.
And also because, communist ideology is becoming obviously irrelevant, even though so many of my students still think that China is communist. But like you read the Constitution, it says, the socialist ownership of capital or socialist ownership of production is complete. There's the class struggle is complete. There's no more proletariat, et cetera, et cetera. Like, so that ideology is becoming less and less relevant. So Xi Jinping is replacing it with nationalism. And so that's why he's building up this nationalist fervor against like Japan, especially. Like you go to China, you turn on the TV and there's like so many channels on 1930s dramas of the Japanese imperialism, like during the war. Like, so they're really trying to bring up, like, revive hatred of Japan. It's really interesting, crazy.
Yeah, that's a really interesting aspect. What you just said, the rehashing of old nationalist films for new nationalist fervor.
Yeah, and so I think this is for domestic purposes, but at the same time, it gets dangerous because China is starting to militarize these islands. Like they've moved ballistic missiles onto some of these artificial islands in the South China Sea. Even though Xi Jinping actually promised Obama in September 2015, I think, that he would not do that. He would not militarize them, but he has militarized them. And so, if the U.S. decides that enough is enough, we're not going to allow you to do this, Xi Jinping has moved to a point where he can't go back because that would hurt the nationalism, right? That you can't be seen as caving into American demands. So, like, there's definitely going to be increasing tensions and conflict, but whether that's going to, have all-out war, I don't think so, because China is still economically and structurally weak, right? I mean, they depend on exporting to the U.S. So, like, a war would just completely destroy the Chinese economy.
Yeah.
So, like, but I think there's definitely going to be increasing tensions. I mean, there already are increasing tensions, right?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of felt all over the world. There's been, like, a rise of nationalist thought, especially in government, virtually everywhere. I don't know about in Africa as much, but probably. That actually reminds me. There's another thing that I think is interesting, and that I don't know that it's connected to your work that I've read per se, but there's been a lot of investment by Chinese firms in developing in Africa, right? So, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so like from the early 2000s up until like maybe 5 years ago, like Chinese loans and investment in Africa, also Latin America, where it was shooting up like crazy. But then there were more and more concerns in Africa about Chinese colonialism. So like China simply replacing European colonialism, because like while these loans don't have the conditions of the IMF and the World Bank, they do have conditions. So like they have to use Chinese state-owned enterprises in these infrastructure projects, and they even bring over Chinese workers. Wow. So like there's very little positive effect in African countries themselves. Like they don't even hire, African workers. Yeah. So like there's Chinatown spreading up around Africa, Chinese restaurants for the Chinese workers. And so we're talking like Kenya, Angola, Nigeria, South Africa, like Tanzania, like all of these countries, their elites are more and more worried about Chinese colonialism. And so what China has been doing is trying to become more multilateral. So these were bilateral loans, and so China could pressure these countries more. But now China is like making these bilateral institutions. So like the BRICS New Development Bank and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So China is rolling back from these bilateral relations and trying to do it more multilaterally. But then, of course, that reduces Chinese power. Yeah. So basically, this has been somewhat of a failure. Like China's tried to increase investment, but then it's caused this backlash. And closer to home, like in Southeast Asia, it's really incredible how many countries have invited the U.S. or asking the U.S. to like increase their relations in East Asia in order to counter the rise of China.
Yeah, well, I mean, also you have to. I mean, I think there's probably some of that is, it looks a lot like the U.S. looks a lot better because it has all of these like institutions like we've been talking about that are kind of completely dominated by it. So like if you're a U.S. university, it looks better than a Chinese university because that's the way the whole thing is structured. I was reading a paper the other day that was about Malaysian business schools. It was like it was about like it was some interviews, and it was also like kind of looking into their development, and it's the exact same thing. Like they developed along what they called the Ohio's university model, because when like these schools were starting for the first time, they had advisors from Ohio State University, which they were talking about how great of a business school it is and like all this stuff, who was telling them, this is how you do it. And they were kind of they were like, sometimes what their advice isn't like applicable at all, but that's still how we teach, right? We're still teaching with this model and method, even though it's not it's not even like how we run business.
And like in the National University of Singapore, which is Singapore's top university, they have a relationship with Yale, right? So they have the NUS Yale University. And like in the Middle East, like in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, they're building American universities, right? Like NYU, they have a campus there, and so it's really a global trend. I mean, even Vietnam, which the U.S. completely obliterated.
Yeah.
Dropped more bombs in Indochina than in World War II. Like all bombs dropped in World War II combined, and like there's still birth defects from the Agent Orange and so on. And Vietnam.
There's still unexploded bombs. Yeah.
Sorry.
There's still unexploded ordinances.
Yeah, still unexploded ordinances. And Vietnam has invited the U.S. Navy back into its ports, to counter the rise of China. I mean, they trust the U.S. more than China. It's unbelievable. Yeah,
I mean that's really incredible.
Yeah.
I don't know a lot. I'm trying to learn more, but I'm a little. There's a lot of things I'm trying to learn about, but I know Vietnam just from hearing some Chomsky talks. He's said that's one of the that's considered a loss because we didn't get all of our objectives, but we got most of them. So could you kind of explain what that entails?
Yeah, I mean the greatest threat is the demonstration effect, right? So a successful model that is alternative to capitalism.
Yeah.
And so what the U.S. wants to make sure is that there is no possible successful model alternative. And so, with Cuba, you had the most vicious embargo, which is still going on today, the most vicious trade embargo that's ever been designed to make sure that Cuba remains dirt poor. And Vietnam, you have the complete obliteration of the food system. Like you go in Vietnam today, like I took the train from south to north, and like on the rice paddies, they still have these big black circles from the Agent Orange where nothing can grow for like 1,000 years.
Yeah.
So they bomb them or trade embargo, whatever, to make sure that they don't become a successful model. So even though U.S. troops had to pull out in 1975, even though North Vietnam officially defeated the U.S., they were so destroyed that their government became dysfunctional. I mean, they became authoritarian, totalitarian, and dirt poor to such an extent, like after a couple decades, by the 1990s, they were basically forced to open up back to global capitalism, right? And so now Vietnam was part of the TPP. I mean, the TPP is ended by Trump, but they want to join. They're desperate to join global capitalism.
Yeah.
And Vietnam is rising because they're getting some of the production from China, like the especially clothing. Some of that low value production is moving from China because Vietnam has even lower wages.
Yeah.
And so so the U.S. I mean, I'm not saying that in 1960s U.S. state planners could predict that Vietnam would come back to global capitalism, right, 20 years later. But like, this is the logic of completely destroying alternatives to capitalism, so that they cannot succeed, so that everyone chooses capitalism eventually.
Yeah, I mean the Vietnam is it's absolutely heinous. Let's see, we were talking about that, and then all right. Well, I had another question, but I forgot it. So I think we're 10 minutes over. I think we can call it a success. I had a good time.
Yeah, me too.
Totally.
It's great talk.
Yeah, so I'll be in contact with you. This has been the Mohalk Valley formula, which interestingly is a technique of scientific union busting. So I've been Evan. My guest has been Professor Sean Stars with the City of Hong Kong University, or City University of Hong Kong?
City University of Hong Kong, yeah.
City University of Hong Kong, scholar in critical political economy, and doing really interesting work in the modes of global capitalism and the power structures within it. This has been on WHUS 91.7. Have a great day.